All right, I'm taking up the Twitter vulnerability up a notch. I'm going to post this video. And mainly it's because if I wrote a thread, it would be like 30 posts long and nobody would read it. I feel like this is the one that requires a little bit more than that. So that's the heart behind this. Who is this for? I think it's for those people that are currently in, about to go through, or maybe just came out of this picture of fallowness, like a metaphorical or spiritual fallowness, like famine, plague, difficulty, loss, whatever you want to describe it as, whatever you're feeling. My hope is that this is clear enough and done in such a way that you will feel a sense of hope, even in the midst of what you're going through or about to go through or have gone through. Um, it all started when I was reading a commentary on Acts by John Polhill. I think that's how you say his name. And I was reading it because I was just kind of processing through Pentecost. And there was something that he drew my attention to that I never really thought about, at least in detail or maybe ever, I'm not sure. But in his commentary, he reminds his readers that Joel's prophecy, which is spoken about by Peter when he's empowered by the Holy Spirit, he gives the context, and the context is directly after a devastating locust plague and devastating famine. I don't know why. I've never even considered the context. I think maybe that it's because when you've got promises of God's fullness, it just doesn't seem to make sense to look at fallowness. I don't know if maybe that's just me, but like I'm so used to fallowness and loss, unfortunately, that when I see God's promises, I tend to try to cling to those. And so, in the midst of all of that, I completely lost the context of what's going on. But chances are the listeners of Peter probably didn't forget what Joel, that reference to Joel's were attached to. Like they, in the midst of their present famine and loss, metaphorical, spiritual, relational, personal, power structure wise, when Peter is saying Joel's prophecy and he's calling back to memory that prophecy, he's calling their memories to a time of historical devastation, just like a trajectory of loss. And so he's doing, like he's making this callback because he's reminding them of where they've been because he's about to show them where they're going to be taken. And he's doing it in a prophetic way for even us today. So when Joel talks about the final days, or when Peter talks about the final days or the last days that are in their midst, and he's reminding them of the past, and he's telling them to be mindful of the present as they look towards the future, yeah, there's promises, but it's also set in the context of fallowness. And why do I think that's important? I think it's important because maybe you, maybe I, maybe them, certainly me for sure, definitely me. I think I'm used to fallowness, and I think I'm used to loss, like devastatingly so to a point where I'm kind of cold to it. Like I'm just like, well, yeah, another day. Maybe that's your experience too. That sadly, like we've become used to the spiritual plagues and famines, the relational plagues and famines, like just the loss, the valley of the dry bones. And so, for whatever reason, when we see God's promises in our midst, I think I very easily and very naturally process all of those good things in the framework and filter of loss, of foulness, of what I'm about to lose. The next shoe is going to drop. My life is going to suck again. So don't get used to the good times because the bad times are right behind it. It's like a swinging door that's going to hit me in the butt, right? And I think it's perfectly natural for us to assume that when we read like last days or last things, that yeah, although God's Spirit's pouring out, that it's just going to be more of the same crap. Like things are progressively going to get worse, and we're just going to experience this compounding reality of famine and plague and loss and fallowness and disaster, and then Jesus is going to come back, and all the things are going to be good again. pretty much like the Left Behind series, I think. Like there's just not going to be hope, there's not going to be light, there's not going to be love. And realistically, like that makes sense to me until it doesn't. Because when I reread Peter's words and when I reread Joel's words, his prophecy, I think maybe for the first time I've become awakened to a new reality. That in the midst of lost and foulness and brokenness and dry bones, Joel is prophesying not about more plague and famine. He's prophesying about giving and restoration. Joel's speaking about an outpouring, not a taking away. He's talking about an overflow, not a lack, an overflow of God's presence, literally world changing, where it's going to turn the world upside down, changing and transforming our realities, making all things new, where wonders will occur, where signs will occur, and then the Lord returns. Like Willie James Jennings says it in his prophecy, and I really hope that you can hear the ice cream truck in the background because it just makes sense. Is that Joel's prophecy spoken by Peter? This is Willie James Jennings here. Proclaims a new world order, which is energized by the movement of the Holy Spirit, breaking through on all flesh and destroying social orders that find slavery useful, stable, and capable of making fundamental differences of identity between would-be masters and would-be slaves. Yet these slaves, men and women, prophesy. God speaks through them and they are to be obeyed. The new world order begins with collapse. And I'm like, what? A collapse literally of old things, like the foulness and the destruction and the devastation, aren't the good things, they're the old things. And they're destroyed by the weight of God's presence in the world. And it's done in and amongst his image bearers. So, like, yes, even today, death and sin are disruptive. And yes, even today, plague and famine disorient, whether literal or metaphorical. But, like, here's the good news: the promise and the truth is that the very Spirit of God realigns our hearts and our minds to his outpouring and renewal. Not all the things that are being stripped away. I'm talking right now. Like, even in the midst of the loss that he sits in with us, he is a presence of renewal and new things. He is the literal potential of his kingdom in the graveyards of our lives. So, like, instead of perpetual destruction, which I unfortunately have become used to, instead he says, I and we are empowered witnesses that speak out and plant ourselves against the disruption and against the disorientation. It's literally like we get to be the weight, the pile-on that destroys the old things because God is making new things. Because yes, Jesus makes all things new as he sits with us in our grief. I'm going to end with a quote from N.T. Wright. N.T. Wright reminds us that God's kingdom is coming in and through the work of Jesus, not by taking people away from this world, but by transforming things within this world, bringing the sphere of earth into the presence and under the rule of heaven itself. That's all I got.